Hello, and welcome back to Baby Elias's stories. We now return to Neverwhere by Neil Gaiman. Chapter 10. Do you drink wine? It asked. Richard nodded. I had a little wine once, said Dole hesitantly. My father, at dinner, would let us taste it. The Angel Islington lifted the bottle. It looked like some kind of decanter. Richard wondered if the bottle was made of glass. It refracted and reflected the candlelight so strangely. Perhaps it was some kind of crystal, or one huge diamond. It even made it seem that the wine inside was glowing, as if it were made of light. The angel took the top of the crystal and poured an inch of the liquid inside it into a wine glass. It was a white wine, but a wine unlike any Richard had ever seen. It threw light around the caverns, like sunlight on a swimming pool. Dor and Richard sat around an age-blackened wooden table on huge wooden chairs and said nothing. This wine, said Islington, is the last bottle of its kind. I was given a dozen bottles by one of your ancestors. It handed the glass to Dor and began to pour another inch of the glowing wine from the decanter into another glass. It did this reverently, almost lovingly, like a priest performing a ritual. It was a welcome gift. This was, 40,000 years ago. Quite a while ago, at any rate. It passed the wine glass to Richard. I suppose that you could accuse me of squandering something I should treasure, it told them. But I receive guests so rarely, and the way here is hard. The Angelus, murmured Dor. You travelled here using the Angelus, yes, but that way works only once for each traveller. The angel raised its glass high, staring at the light. Drink it carefully, it advised them. It is most potent. It sat down at the table between Richard and Dor. When one tastes it, it said wistfully, I like to imagine that one is actually tasting the sunlight of bygone days. It held up its glass. A toast to former glories. Former glories, chorused Richard and Dor. And then, a little warily, they tasted the wine, sipping it, not drinking. It's amazing, said Dor. It really is, said Richard. I thought old wines turned to vinegar when they were exposed to air. The angel shook its head. Not this one. It is all a matter of the type of grape and the place it was grown. This kind of grape, alas, perished when the vineyard vanished beneath the waves. It's magical, said Dor, sipping the liquid light. I've never tasted anything like it. And you never will again, said Islington. There is no more wine from Atlantis. Somewhere inside Richard, a small, reasonable voice pointed out that there never was an Atlantis. And, thus emboldened, went on to state that there were no such things as angels, and that furthermore Most of his experiences of the last few days had been impossible. Richard ignored it. He was learning awkwardly to trust his instincts and to realize that the simplest and most likely explanations for what he had seen and experienced recently were the ones that had been offered to him, no matter how unlikely they might seem. He opened his mouth and tasted the wine once more. It made him feel happy. It made him think of skies bigger and bluer than any he had ever seen. A golden sun hanging huge in the sky. Everything simpler, everything younger than the world he knew. There was a waterfall to the left of them. Clear water ran down the rock and collected in the rock pool. To the right of them was a door set between two iron pillars. The door was made of polished flint set in a metal that was almost black. "You really claim to be an angel?" Richard asked. "I mean, you've actually met God and everything?" Islington smiled. "I claim nothing, Richard," it said, "but I am an angel." "You honor us," said Dor. "No, you do me much honor by coming here. Your father was a good man, Dor, and a friend to me. I was deeply saddened by his death. He said in his journal, he said I should come to you. He said I could trust you. I only hope that I can be worthy of that trust." The angel sipped its wine. "London below is the second city that I have cared for. The first sank beneath the waves, and there was nothing I could do to prevent it. I know what pain is and loss. You have my sympathies. What would you like to know?" Dor paused. "My family. They were killed by Krupp and Vandemar. But who ordered it? I want to know why." The angel nodded. "Many secrets find their way down to me," it said. "Many rumors and half-truths and echoes." Then it turned to Richard. "And you, what do you want, Richard Mayhew?" Richard shrugged. "I want my life back, and my apartment, and my job." "That can happen," said the angel. "Yeah, right," said Richard flatly. "Do you doubt me, Richard Mayhew?" asked the angel Islington. Richard looked into its eyes. They were a luminescent grey, eyes as old as the universe, eyes that had seen galaxies congeal from stardust 10 million years ago. Richard shook his head. Islington smiled at him kindly. "It will not be easy, and you and your companions will face some very real difficulties, both in the task and in the return. But there could be a way that we can learn, a key to all of our problems." It got up and walked over to a small rock shelf, where it picked up a figurine, one of several on the shelf. It was a small black statuette depicting some kind of animal made of volcanic glass. The angel handed it to Dor. This will bring you safely through the last stage of your journey back to me," it said. "The rest is up to you." "What do you want us to do?" asked Richard. "The Black Friars are custodians of a key," it said. "Bring it to me." "And you can use it to find out who killed my family?" asked Dor. "I hope so," said the angel. Richard finished his glass of wine. He felt it warming him, running through him. He had the strange feeling that if he looked down at his fingers, he would be able to see the wine glowing through them, as if he were made of light. "Good luck," whispered the angel Islington. There was a rushing sound, like a wind soughing across a lost forest, or the beating of mighty wings. Richard and Dor were sitting on the floor in a room in the British Museum, staring up at a carved painting of an angel on a cathedral door. The room was dark and empty. The party had been over for a long time. The sky outside was beginning to lighten. Richard stood up, then leaned down and helped Dor up. "Black Friars," he said. Dor nodded. He had crossed Blackfriars Bridge in the city of London many times, and had often passed through Blackfriars Station, but he had learned by now not to assume anything. "People." Richard walked over to the Angelus. He ran a finger down its painted robe. "Do you think he can really do it? Get me my life back?" "I've never heard of such a thing, but I don't think he would have lied to us. He is an angel." Dor opened her hand, looked at the statue of the beast. "My father had one of these," she said sadly. She put it deep in one of the pockets of her brown leather jacket. "Well," said Richard, "we're not going to get the key back by lollygagging around here, are we?" They walked through the empty museum corridors. "So what do you know about this key then?" asked Richard. "Nothing," said Dor. They had reached the main doors of the museum. "I've heard of the Black Friars, but I've never actually had anything to do with them." She pressed her fingers against a seriously locked glass door, which swung open at her touch. "A bunch of monks," said Richard thoughtfully. "I bet if we just tell them it's for an angel, a real one, they'll give us the sacred key and throw in the magic can opener and the amazing whistling corkscrew as a surprise bonus." He began to laugh. He wondered if the wine was still affecting him. "You're in good spirits," said Dor. He nodded enthusiastically. "I'm going to go home. Everything is going to be normal again, boring again, wonderful again." Richard looked at the stone steps that led up the British Museum and decided that they were made to be danced down by Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers, and seeing that neither of them happened to be available, he began to dance down the steps, doing a Fred Astaire impersonation, while humming something approximately halfway between Putin on the Ritz and Top Hat, White Tie and Tails. "Ya da 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 ya," he sang, soft shooing down the steps and up again. Dor stood at the top of the steps, staring at him in horror. Then she began to giggle helplessly. She looked up at her and doffed his imaginary white silk top hat to her, mime tossing it high in the air, catching it and putting it back on his head. "Twit," said Dor and smiled at him. In response, Richard grabbed her hand and continued dancing up and down the steps. Dor hesitated for a moment, then she too began to dance. She danced much better than Richard did. At the bottom of the steps they tumbled, breathless and exhausted, and giggling into each other's arms. Richard felt his world spin. He felt her heart beating against his chest. The moment began to transmute, and he wondered if there was something he should do. He wondered if he should kiss her. He wondered if he wanted to kiss her, and he realized that he truly did not know. He looked into her amazing eyes. Dor put her head on one side and pulled free. She pulled up the collar on her brown leather jacket, pulled it around her armor and protection. Pulled it around her armor and protection. "Let's go and find our bodyguard," said Dole, and they walked away together down the sidewalk toward British Museum Station, stumbling only a little from time to time. "What," asked Mr. Croup, "do you want?" "What?" asked the Marquise de Carabas, a little more rhetorically. "Does anyone want?" "Dead things," suggested Mr. Vandermeer. "Extra teeth." "I thought perhaps we could make a deal," said the Marquise. Mr. Croup began to laugh. It sounded like a piece of blackboard being dragged over the nails of a wall of severed fingers. "Oh, Messiah Marquise, I think I can confidently state, with no risk of contradiction from any parties here present, that you have taken leave of whatever senses you are reputed to have had. You are," he confided, "if you will permit the vulgarism, completely off your head." "Say the word," said Mr. Vandermeer, who was now standing behind the Marquise's chair, "and it'll be off his neck before you can say Jack Ketch." The Marquise breathed heavily on his fingernails and polished them on the lapel of his coat. "I have always felt," he said, "that violence was the last refuge of the incompetent, and empty threats the final sanctuary of the terminally inept." Mr. Croup glared. "What are you doing here?" he hissed. The Marquise de Carabas stretched like a big cat, a lynx perhaps, or a huge black panther, and at the end of the stretch he was standing up, with his hands thrust deep in the pockets of his magnificent coat. "You are," he said idly and conversationally, "I understand, Mr. Croup, a collector of Tang Dynasty figurines?" "How did you know that?" "People tell me things. I'm approachable." The Marquise's smile was pure, untroubled, guileless, the smile of a man selling you a used Bible. "Even if I were," began Mr. Croup. "If you were," said the Marquise de Carabas, "you might be interested in this." He took one hand out of his pocket and displayed it to Mr. Croup. Until earlier that evening it had sat in a glass case in the vaults of one of London's leading merchant banks. It was listed in certain catalogues as the Spirit of Autumn. Grave figure. It was roughly 8 inches high, a piece of glazed pottery that had been shaped and painted and fired while Europe was in the Dark Ages, 600 years before Columbus's first voyage. Mr. Croup hissed involuntarily and reached for it. The Marquise pulled it out of reach, cradled it to his chest. "No, no," said the Marquise. "It's not as simple as that." "No?" asked Mr. Croup. "But what's to stop us taking it and leaving pieces of you all over the underside? We've never dismembered a Marquise before."
"Have," said Mr. Vandermeer, "in York, in the 14th century, in the rain."
"He wasn't a Marquise," said Mr. Croup. "He was the Earl of Exeter."
"And Marquis of Westmoreland?"
Mr. Vandermeer looked rather pleased with himself. Mr. Croup sniffed. "What's to stop us hacking you into as many pieces as we hacked the Marquis of Westmoreland?" he said. He asked. The Carabas took his other hand out of his pocket. It held a small hammer. He tossed the hammer in the air and caught it by the handle, ending with the hammer poised over the china figurine. "Oh, please," he said. "No more silly threats. I think I'd feel better if you were both standing back over there." Mr. Vandermeer shot a look at Mr. Croup, who nodded almost imperceptibly. There was a tremble in the air, and Mr. Vandermeer was standing beside Mr. Croup, who smiled like a skull. "I have indeed been known to purchase the occasional tang piece," he admitted. "Is that for sale?" "We don't go in so much for buying and selling here in the underside, Mr. Croup. Barter, exchange, that's what we look for. But yes, indeed, this desirable little piece is certainly up for grabs." Mr. Croup pursed his lips. He folded his arms. He unfolded them. He ran one hand through his greasy hair. Then, "Name your price," said Mr. Croup. The Marquise let him breathe a deep, relieved, and almost audible sigh. It was possible that he was going to be able to pull this whole grandoir ruse off after all. "First, 3 answers to 3 questions," he said. Croup nodded. "Each way, we get 3 answers too." "Fair enough," said the Marquise. "Secondly, I get safe conduct out of here, and you agree to give me at least an hour's head start." Croup nodded violently. "Agreed. Ask your first question." His gaze was fixed on the statue. "First question, who are you working for?" "Oh, that's an easy one," said Mr. Croup. "That's a simple answer. We are working for our employer, who wishes to remain nameless." "Humph. Why did you kill Dawes' family?" "Orders from our employer," said Mr. Croup, his smile becoming more foxy by the moment. "Why didn't you kill Daw when you had a chance?" Before Mr. Croup could answer, Mr. Vandermeer said, "Got to keep her alive. She's the only one that can open the door." Mr. Croup glared at his associate. "That's it," he said. "Tell him everything, why don't you?" "I wanted a turn," muttered Mr. Vandermeer. "Right," said Mr. Croup. "So you've got 3 answers for all the good that will do you. My first question. Why are you protecting her?" "Her father saved my life," said the Marquise honestly. "I never paid off my debt to him. I prefer debts to be paid. I prefer debts to be in my favor."
"I've got a question,"
said Mr. Vandermeer. "As have I, Mr. Vandermeer. The upworlder, Richard Mayhew. Why is he traveling with her? Why does she permit it?" "Sentimentality on her part," said the Marquise de Carabas. He wondered, as he said it, if that was the whole truth. He had begun to wonder whether there might, perhaps, be more to the upper worlder than met the eye.
"Now me," said Mr. Vandermeer. "What number am I thinking of?"
"I beg your pardon?"
"What number am I thinking of?"
repeated Mr. Vandermeer.
"It's between 1 and a lot,"
he added helpfully. 7, said the Marquise. Mr. Vandermeer nodded, impressed. Mr. Croup began. "Where is the—" But the Marquise shook his head. He said. "Now we're getting greedy." There was a moment of utter silence in that dank cellar. Then once more water dripped and maggots rustled, and the Marquise said, "An hour's head start, remember?" Of course, said Mr. Croup. The Marquise de Carabas tossed the figurine to Mr. Croup, who caught it eagerly, like an addict catching a plastic baggie filled with white powder of dubious legality. And then, without a backward glance, the Marquise left the cellar. Mr. Croup examined the figurine minutely, turning it over and over in his hands. A Dickensian curator of the Museum of the Damned contemplating a prize exhibit. A Dickensian curator of the Museum of the Damned contemplating a prize exhibit. His tongue flicked out from time to time like a snake's. A perceptible flush appeared on his pallid cheeks. "Oh, fine, fine," he whispered. "Tang Dynasty indeed. 1200 years old. The finest pottery figurines ever made on this earth. This was created by Kai Lang, finest of potters. There is not a twin to it in existence. Examine the color of the glaze, the sense of proportion, the life." He was smiling now like a baby. The innocent smile looked lost and confused on the shady terrain of Mr. Croup's face. "It adds a little wonder and beauty to the world." And then he grinned, too widely, and lowered his face to the figurine, and crushed its head in his teeth, chomping and chewing wildly, swallowing in lumps. His teeth ground the china to a fine powder which dusted the lower part of his face. He gloried in its destruction, throwing himself into it with the strange madness and uncontrolled bloodlust of a fox in a henhouse. And then, when the statue was nothing but dust, he turned to Mr. Vandemar. He seemed strangely mellow, almost languid. "How long did we say we'd give him?"
"An hour."
And how long has it been?"
6 minutes.
Croup lowered his head. He ran a finger across his chin, licked the powdered clay from his fingertip. "You follow him, Mr. Vandemar," said Mr. Croup. "I need a little more time in which to savor the occasion." Hunter could hear them walking down the steps. She was standing in the shadows with her arms folded, in the same position she had been in when they left her. Richard was humming loudly. Dor was giggling helplessly. Then she would stop and tell Richard to be quiet. Then she would start giggling again. They walked past Hunter without noticing her. She stepped out of the shadows and said, "You have been gone for 8 hours." It was a statement of fact without reproach or curiosity. Dor blinked at her. "It didn't seem that long." Hunter said nothing. Richard grinned blearily at her. "Don't you want to know what happened?" "Well, we got ambushed by Mr. Croup and Mr. Vandemar. Unfortunately, we didn't have a bodyguard around. Still, I gave them a good run for their money." Hunter raised a perfect eyebrow. "I am in awe of your pugilistic talents," she said coolly. Dor giggled. "He's kidding. Actually, they killed us." "And as an expert in the termination of bodily functions," Hunter said, "I must beg to differ. You are neither of you dead. You are neither of you dead. At a guess, you are both very drunk." Dor stuck her tongue out at her bodyguard. "Nonsense! Touched hardly a drop. That much." She held out 2 fingers to show how tiny an amount that much was. "Just went to a party," said Richard, "and saw Jessica, and saw a real angel, and got a little black pig, and came back here." "Just a little drink," continued Dor intently. Old drink. Tiny little drink, very small, almost not there." She began to hiccup. Then she giggled again. A hiccup interrupted her. And she sat down suddenly on the platform. "I think maybe we're a bit smashed," she said soberly. Then she closed her eyes and began solemnly to snore. The Marquis de Carabas was running through the underways as if all the hounds of hell had his scent and were on his trail. He was splashing through 6 grey inches of the Tyburn, the hangman's river, kept safe in the darkness in a brick sewer beneath Park Lane, on its way south to Buckingham Palace. He had been running for 17 minutes. 30 feet below Marble Arch he paused. The sewer divided into branches. The Marquis de Carabas ran down the left-hand branch. Several minutes later, Mr. Vandermeer walked through the sewer, and when he reached the junction, he too paused for a few moments, sniffing the air, and then he too walked down the left-hand branch. Hunter dropped Richard Mayhew's unconscious body into a pile of straw with a grunt. He rolled in the straw, said something that sounded like "Forthrill, bluggle, wobbly wog," and went back to sleep. She put Dor down in the straw next to him more gently. Then she stood beside Dor in the dark stables under the ground, on guard still. The Marquis de Carabas was exhausted. He leaned against the tunnel wall and stared at the steps that went up ahead of him. Then he pulled out the golden pocket watch and looked at the time. 35 minutes had passed since he had fled the hospital cellar.
Is it an hour yet?
Asked Mr. Vandermeer. He was sitting on the steps ahead of the Marquis, picking his nails with a knife. "Not even close," gasped the Marquis.
Felt like an hour,
said Mr. Vandermeer helpfully. There was a shiver in the world, and Mr. Croup stood behind the Marquis de Carabas. He still had powder on his chin. De Carabas stared at Mr. Croup. He turned back to look at Mr. Vandermeer, and then spontaneously the Marquis de Carabas began to laugh. Mr. Croup smiled. "You find us funny, Messiah Marquis, do you not? A source of amusement, is that not so? With our pretty clothes and our convoluted circumlocutions." Mr. Vandermeer muttered,
I haven't got a circumlo.
"And our little sillinesses of manner and behavior, and perhaps we are funny." Mr. Croup raised one finger then and waggled it at de Carabas. "But you must never imagine," he continued, "that just because something is funny, Messiah Marquis, it is not also dangerous." And Mr. Vandermeer threw his knife at the Marquis hard and accurately. It hit him, hilt first on the temple. His eyes rolled up in his head and his knees buckled. "Circumlocution," said Mr. Croup to Mr. Vandermeer. "It's a way of speaking around something, a digression, verbosity." Mr. Vandermeer picked up the Marquis de Carabas by his waistband and dragged him up the stairs, his head bumping on each step as they went, and Mr. Vandermeer nodded.
I wondered,
he said. Watching their dreams now as they slept, Hunter sleeps standing up. In her dream, Hunter is in the Undercity beneath Bangkok. It is partly a maze and partly a forest, for the wilderness of Thailand has retreated deep beneath the ground, under the airport and the hotels and the streets. The world smells of spice and dried mango, and it also smells, not unpleasantly, of sex. It is humid, and she is sweating. It is dark, broken by phosphorescent patches on the wall, greenish-grey fungi that give light enough to fool the eye, light enough to walk by. In her dream, Hunter moves silent as a ghost through the wet tunnels, pushing her way through vegetation. She holds a weighted throwing stick in her right hand. A leather shield covers her left forearm. She smells it in her dream, acrid and animal, and she pauses beside a wall of ruined masonry, and she waits, part of the shadows, one with the darkness. Hunting, like life, Hunter believes, consists chiefly of waiting. In Hunter's dream, however, she does not wait. Upon her arrival, it comes through the underbrush, a fury of brown and of white, undulating gently, like a wet-furred snake, its red eyes bright and peering through the darkness, its teeth like needles, a carnivore and a killer. The creature is extinct in the world above. It waits. It weighs almost 300 pounds and is a little over 15 feet long from the tip of its nose to the tip of its tail. As it passes her, she hisses like a snake, and momentarily, old instincts kicking in, it freezes. And then it leaps at her, nothing but hate and sharp teeth. She remembers then, in her dream, that this had happened before, and that when it had happened, that time in the past, she had pushed the leather arm shield into its mouth and crushed its skull with the leaden throwing stick, taking care not to damage the pelt. She had given the great weasel's pelt to a girl who had caught her eye, and the girl had been appropriately grateful. But now, in her dream, that is not happening. Instead, the weasel is reaching out a forepaw toward her, and she is dropping her throwing stick and taking its paw. And then and there, in the undercity beneath Bangkok, they are dancing together in one intricate, unending dance, and Hunter is watching them from outside herself, and she is admiring the elaborate movements they make as they move. Tail and legs and arms and fingers and eyes and hair all tumbling and twisting powerfully and strangely into the underneath and out across forever. There is a tiny noise in the waking world, a dreaming whimper from the child door, and Hunter moves from sleeping to waking fluidly, and instantly she is alert once more and on guard. She forgets her dream entirely upon waking. Do is dreaming of her father. In her dream, he is showing her how to open things. He picks up an orange and gestures in one smooth movement. It inverts and twists. The orange flesh is on the outside now, and the skin is in the center on the inside. One must always maintain parity, her father tells her, peeling off an inside-out orange segment for her. Parity, symmetry, topology. These will be our subjects for the months to come, Do. But the most important thing for you to understand is this. All things want to open. You must feel that need and use it. Her father's hair is brown and thick, as it was a decade before his death, and he has an easy smile, which she remembers, but which time had diminished as the years went on. In her dream, he passes her a padlock. She takes it from him. Her hands are the size and shape of her hands today, although she knows that, in truth, this occurred when she was a tiny child, that she is taking moments and conversations and lessons from over a dozen years and is compressing them into one lesson. Open it, he tells her. She holds it in her hand, feeling the cold metal, feeling the weight of the lock in her hands. Something is bothering her. There is something she has to know. Door learned to open sometime after she learned to walk. She remembers her mother holding her tightly, opening a door from Door's bedroom to the playroom. remembers watching her brother arch, separating linked silver rings, joining them back together. She tries to open the padlock. She fumbles at it with her fingers, and with her mind, nothing happens. She throws the padlock down onto the floor and begins to cry. Her father reaches down and picks up the padlock, puts it back into her hand. His long finger brushes away a tear from her cheek. "Remember," he tells her, "the padlock wants to open. All you have to do is let it do what it wants." It sits there in her hand, cold and inert and heavy. And then suddenly she understands, and somewhere in her heart, she lets it be what it wants to be. There is a loud click. The padlock opens. Her father is smiling. "There," she says. "Good girl," says her father. "That's all there is to opening. Everything else is just technique." She realizes what it is that is bothering her. "Father," she asks, "your journal, who put it away? Who could have hidden it?" But he is receding from her, and already she is forgetting. She calls to him, but he cannot hear her, and although she can hear his voice in the distance, she can no longer make out what he is saying. In the waking world, Dor whimpers softly. Then she rolls over, cradles her arm around her face, snorts once, twice, then sleeps once more. Sleeps without dreaming. Richard knows it waits for them. Each tunnel he goes down, each turning, each branch he walks, the feeling grows in urgency and weight. He knows it is there, waiting, and the sense of impending catastrophe increases with every step. He knows that it should have been a relief when he turns the final corner and sees it standing there, framed in the tunnel, waiting for him. Instead, he feels only dread. In his dream, it is the size of the world. There is nothing left in the world but the beast, its flanks steaming, broken spars and juts of old weapons prickling from its hide. There is dried blood on its horns and on its tusks. It is gross and vast and evil. And then it charges. He raises his hand, but it isn't his hand, and he throws the spear at the creature. He sees its eyes, wet and vicious and gloating, as they float toward him, all in a fraction of a second that becomes a tiny forever, and then it is upon him. The water was cold, and it hit Richard's face like a slap. His eyes jerked open, and he caught his breath. Hunter was looking down at him. She was holding a large wooden bucket. It was empty. He reached up one hand. His hair was soaked, and his face was wet. He wiped the water from his eyes and shivered with cold. "You didn't have to do that," said Richard. His mouth tasted like several small animals had been using it as a rest room. He tried to stand, and then he sat down again, suddenly. "Oh," he explained. "How's your head?" asked Hunter, professionally. "It's been better," said Richard. Hunter picked up another wooden bucket, this one filled with water, and hauled it across the stable floor. "I don't know what you drank," she said, "but it must have been potent." Hunter dipped her hand into the bucket and flicked it at Dor's face, spraying her with water. Dor's eyes flickered. "No wonder Atlantis sank," muttered Richard. "If they all felt like this in the morning, it was probably a relief. Where are we?" Hunter flicked another handful of water at Dor's face. "In the stables of a friend," she said. Richard looked around. The place did look a little like a stable. He wondered if it were for horses. And if so, what kind of horses would live beneath the ground? There was a device painted on the wall. The letter S, or was it a snake, Richard could not tell, circled by 7 stars. Dor reached a tentative hand up to her head and touched it, experimentally, as if she were unsure just what she might find. "Ooh," she said in a near whisper. "Temple and arch, am I dead?" "No," said Hunter. "Pity." Hunter helped her to a standing position. "Well," said Dor sleepily, "he did warn us it was strong." And then Dor woke up completely. Very hard, very fast. She grabbed Richard's shoulder, pointed to the device on the wall, the snaky S with the stars surrounding it. She gasped. "Serpentine," she said to Hunter. "That's Serpentine's crest, Richard. Get up. We have to run before she finds out we're here." "And do you think," asked a dry voice from the doorway, "that you could enter Serpentine's house without Serpentine knowing, child?" Dor pushed herself back against the wood of the stable wall. She was trembling. Richard realized through the pounding in his head that he had never seen Dor so actually and obviously scared before. Serpentine stood in the doorway. She was wearing a white leather corset and high white leather boots, and the remains of what looked like it had once, long ago, been a silken lace confection of a white wedding dress, now shredded and dirt-stained and torn. She towered above them all. Her shock of graying hair brushed the door lintel. Her eyes were sharp and her mouth was a cruel slash in an imperious face. She looked at Dor as if she looked terror as her due, as if she had become so used to fear that she now expected it, even liked it. "Calm yourself," said Hunter. "But she's Serpentine," wailed Dor, "of the 7 sisters." Serpentine inclined her head cordially. Then she stepped out of the doorway and walked toward them. Behind her was a thin woman with a severe face and long dark hair, wearing a black dress pinched wasp-thin at the waist. The woman said nothing. Serpentine walked over to Hunter. "Hunter worked for me long ago," said Serpentine. She reached out a white finger and gently stroked Hunter's brown cheek with it, a gesture of affection and possession. And then, "You've kept your looks better than I, Hunter." Hunter looked down. "Her friends are my friends, child," said Serpentine. "You are Dor?" "Yes," said Dor, dry-mouthed. Serpentine turned on Richard. "And what are you?" she asked, unimpressed. "Richard," said Richard. "I am Serpentine," she told him graciously. "So I gathered," said Richard. "There is food waiting for all of you," said Serpentine, "should you wish to break your fast." "Oh God, no," whimpered Richard politely. Dor said nothing. She was still backed against the wall, still trembling gently, like a leaf in an autumn breeze. The fact that Hunter had clearly brought them there, the fact that Hunter had clearly brought them here as a safe haven was doing nothing to assuage her fear. "What is there to eat?" asked Hunter. Serpentine looked at the wasp-waisted woman in the doorway. "Well?" she asked. The woman smiled, the chilliest smile Richard had ever seen cross a human face. Then she said, "Fried eggs, poached eggs, pickled eggs, curried venison, pickled onions, pickled herrings, smoked herrings, salted herrings, mushroom stew, salted bacon, stuffed cabbage, calf's foot jelly." Richard opened his mouth to plead with her to stop, but it was too late. He was suddenly, violently, awfully sick. He wanted someone to hold him, to tell him that everything would be all right, that he'd soon be feeling better. someone to give him an aspirin and a glass of water and show him back to his bed, but nobody did, and his bed was another life away. He washed the sick from his face and hands with water from the bucket. Then he washed out his mouth. Then, swaying gently, he followed the 4 women to breakfast. "Pass the calf's foot jelly," said Hunter with a mouthful. Serpentine's dining room was on what appeared to be the smallest underground platform that Richard had ever seen. It was about 12 feet long, and much of that space was taken up with a dinner table. A white damask cloth was laid on the table, and a formal silver dinner service on that. The table was piled high with evil-smelling foodstuffs. The pickled quail's eggs, thought Richard, smelled the worst. His skin felt clammy, and his eyes felt like they had been put in their sockets wrong, while his skull gave him the general impression that someone had removed it while he had slept and swapped it for another 2 or 3 sizes too small. An underground train went past a few feet from them. The wind of its passage whipped at the table. The noise of its passage went through Richard's head like a hot knife through brains. Richard groaned. "Ugh. Your hero is unable to hold his wine, I see," observed Serpentine, dispassionately. "He's not my hero," said Dor. "I'm afraid he is. You learn to recognize the type. Something in the eyes, perhaps." She turned to the woman in black, who appeared to be some kind of major domo. "A restorative for the gentleman." The woman smiled thinly and glided away. Dor picked at a mushroom dish. "We are very grateful for all this, Lady Serpentine," she said. Serpentine sniffed. "Just Serpentine, child. I have no time for silly honorifics and imaginary titles. So, you're Portico's oldest girl?" "Yes." Serpentine dipped her finger in the briny sauce that held what appeared to be several small eels. She licked her finger, nodded approvingly. "I had little time for your father. All that foolishness about uniting the underside. Stuff and nonsense. Silly man. Just asking for trouble. The last time I saw your father, I told him that if he ever came back here, I'd turn him into a blind worm." She turned to Dor. "How is your father, by the way?" "He's dead," said Dor. Serpentine looked perfectly satisfied. "See?" she said. "My point exactly." Dor said nothing. Serpentine picked at something that was moving in her grey hair. She examined it closely, crushed it between finger and thumb, and dropped it onto the platform. Then she turned to Hunter, who was demolishing a small hill of pickled herrings. "You're beast hunting, then," she said. Hunter nodded, her mouth full. "You'll need the spear, of course," said Serpentine. The wasp-waisted woman was now standing next to Richard, holding a small tray. On the tray was a small glass containing an aggressively emerald-colored liquid. Richard stared at it, then looked at Dor. "What are you giving him?" asked Dor. "Nothing that will hurt him," said Serpentine with a frosty smile. "You are guests." Richard knocked back the green liquid, which tasted of thyme and peppermint and winter mornings. He felt it go down and prepared himself to try to keep it from coming back up again. Instead, he took a deep breath and realized, with a little surprise, that his head no longer hurt and that he was starving. Old Bailey was not intrinsically one of those people put in the world to tell jokes. Despite this handicap, he persisted in trying. He he loved to tell shaggy dog stories of inordinate length, which would end in a sad pun, although often as not, Old Bailey would be unable to remember it by the time he got there. The only public for Old Bailey's jokes consisted of a small captive audience of birds, who, particularly the rooks, viewed his jokes as deep and philosophical parables containing profound and penetrating insights into what it meant to be human, and who would actually ask him from time to time to tell them another of his amusing stories.
All right,
Old Bailey was saying.
Stop me if you heard this one before. There was a man walked into a bar. No, he wasn't a man. That's the joke. Sorry, he was a horse. A horse. No, a piece of string. 3 pieces of string. Right. 3 pieces of string walk into a bar.
The huge old rook croaked a question. Old Bailey rubbed his chin, then shrugged.
They just do. It's a joke. They can walk in the joke. He asks for a drink for himself, and one for each of his friends. And then the barman says, "We don't serve pieces of string here," to one of the pieces of string. So it goes back to its friend and says, "They don't serve strings here." And it's a joke. So the middle one does it too. 3 of them, you see. Then the last one, he ties himself around the middle and he pulls the end of him all out and he orders a drink.
The rook croaked again sagely.
3 drinks. Right. And the barman says, "Here, aren't you one of those pieces of string?" And he says, the piece of string, he says, "No, I'm afraid not." Afraid not, you see. Afraid not. Pun. Very, very funny.
The starlings made polite noises. The rooks nodded their heads, put their heads on one side. Then the oldest rook cawed at Bailey.
"Another? I'm not made of hilarity, you know."
"Let me think." There was a noise from the tent, a deep pulsing noise, like the beating of a distant heart. Old Bailey hurried into his tent. The noise was coming from an old wooden chest in which Old Bailey kept those things he most prized. He opened the chest. The throbbing noise became much louder. The small silver box was sitting on the top of Old Bailey's treasures. He reached down one gnarly hand and picked it up. A red light rhythmically pulsed and glowed inside it, like a heartbeat, and shone out through the silver filigree and through the cracks and fastenings.
"He's in trouble," said Old Bailey.
The oldest rook cawed a question.
"No, it's not a joke, it's the Marquis," said Old Bailey. "He's in deep trouble."
Richard was halfway through the second plate of breakfast when Serpentine pushed her chair back from the table.
"I think I have had my fill of hospitality," she said. "Child, young man, good day."
"Hunter," she paused. Then she ran one claw-like finger along the line of Hunter's jaw.
"Hunter, you are always welcome here."
She nodded to them imperiously and stood up and walked away, followed by her wasp-waisted butler. "We should leave now," said Hunter. She stood up from the table, and Dor and Richard, more reluctantly, followed her. They walked along a corridor that was too thin to allow more than one of them to pass at a time. They went up some stone steps. They crossed an iron bridge in the darkness, while underground trains echoed by beneath them. Then they entered what seemed like an endless network of underground vaults that smelled of damp and decay, of brick and stone and time.
"That was your old boss, eh? She seemed nice enough," said Richard to Hunter.
Hunter said nothing. Dor, who had been somewhat subdued, said, "When they want to make children behave themselves in the underside, they tell them, 'Behave or Serpentine will take you.' Oh, said Richard. And you worked for her, Hunter? I worked for the 7 sisters. I thought that they hadn't spoken to each other for, at least 30 years, said Doe. Quite possibly, but they were still talking then. How old are you? Asked Doe. Richard was pleased she had asked. He would never have dared. As old as my tongue, said Hunter primly, and a little older than my teeth. Anyway, said Richard, in the under-troubled tone of voice of one whose hangover had left him and who knew that, somewhere far above them, someone was having a beautiful day. That was okay, nice food, and no one was trying to kill us. I'm sure that will remedy itself as the day goes on, said Hunter accurately. Which way to the Blackfriars, my lady? Doe paused and concentrated. We'll go the river way, she said. Over here. Is he coming around yet? Asked Mr. Croup. Mr. Vandemar prodded the Marquise's prone body with one long finger. The breathing was shallow. Not yet, Mr. Croup. I think I broke him. You must be more careful with your toys, Mr. Vandemar, said Mr. Croup.